Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Today, we continue our look through Paul Copan's Is God a Moral Monster? Making Sense of the Old Testament God. These are the contents of that book. Please feel free to pause the video to get a closer look at those. Here's Paul Copan, got his PhD from the University of Marquette. He's the Pledger Family Chair of Philosophy and Ethics at Palm Beach Atlantic University in Florida. He's the author-editor of over 20 apologetics and philosophy books and lives with his wife and 5 children in Florida. Today on Blessed Man Meditations, we're going through the 7th chapter of Is God a Moral Monster? The title is The Bible's Ubiquitous Weirdness, Kosher Foods and Kooky Laws, Part 1. So he begins by saying, Copan says, imagine a triangle with the following categories. God's at the top corner of this triangle. God's people are at one of the bottom corners of the triangle, and the land of Israel is at the other bottom corner. There's a picture of the triangle. The law given to Israel by Moses emphasized these 3 intimately connected angles: the theological, the social, and the economic. These intertwined themes undergirded God's covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai. The land, the economic, is a gift of God, the theological, to his covenant people, the social. So when a neighbor, say, moves the boundary stones to enlarge his own territory, this has a social impact, affecting his neighbor's livelihood. The act of theft from a neighbor isn't just a societal violation, it's a violation against God as well. Or consider how adultery throws a family into upheaval, not to mention creating a tear in Israel's social fabric. It was an offense against God as well. So when the one God makes a covenant with his people, like he did at Mount Sinai, just before providing a land for them, God is attempting to reshape his people into a nation very much unlike their neighbors. He wants them to live separately from them. He wants them to live morally separately from them, and not worship the false gods that they worship. Regarding Israelite society, sociological research reveals that early on, Israel's identity was classified by tribes, clans, and households, or extended families. In short, Israel had a tribal and kinship structure. Economic, judicial, religious, and even military aspects of life were oriented around this social formation. By contrast, the Canaanite had a kind of feudal system, with a powerful elite at the top and peasants at the bottom. Regarding the land, many extended families were landowning households. These family units had considerable social freedom. Israelite society was socially decentralized and non-hierarchical until the time of Solomon onward. By contrast, Canaanite kings owned all the land. Peasants had to work the land as tenants and pay taxes. Again, we have dramatic improvements in Israelite law in contrast to the Canaanites. So, Copan spoke previously of this gradual moral progression, and we see that gradual moral progression illustrated here. At Sinai, the Creator bound himself to Israel in a loving covenant. The Mosaic law, which extends from Exodus 20 to Numbers 10, and is recapitulated in Deuteronomy, which means the second law, for the next generation of Israelites about to enter Canaan. Included in this covenant are apparently odd and arbitrary Old Testament laws. The atheist Bertrand Russell wondered about the command not to boil a goat in the milk of its mother. And those references, I believe, are the commands to not boil the kid goat in its mother's milk. This demand seems arbitrary to our ears, Russell claimed, because it was rooted in some ancient ritual. Like Russell, when we read commands regarding clothing laws, planting laws, food laws, laws prohibiting tattoos or ruining the corners of a beard, we may ask ourselves, why in the world is a law like this in there? What is the point of including this type of a law? Apart from their purpose for national Israel in the Old Testament, what good are these laws for us today? Do these laws have any relevance for us today? Even though Christians aren't under the Mosaic covenant, but they are under grace, what relationship does the Mosaic covenant have to those of us who live in the new covenant era initiated by Christ? Keep in mind this statement that is worthy of full acceptance. The law of Moses is not eternal and unchanging. Despite what the new atheists assume, Old Testament sages and seers themselves announced that the law of Moses was intentionally temporary. So when you look at these Old Testament commands and they seem barbaric, we forget, the new atheists forget rather, that these commands were not designed to be permanent. Yes, we see God saying things like, you shall not add a word to which, you shall not add to the word which I'm commanding you, nor take away from it. But even here, it is in the context of imageless worship. We also see adaptation within the law itself, such as Zelophehad's daughters requesting an upgraded legislation to address their inheritance question. Furthermore, Old Testament saints awaited a new covenant that would come through Christ, and was foretold in Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36. Within the law itself, we're told that a time would come when God would circumcise the hearts of his people. So let's not think that we're talking about the universal application of all Old Testament laws for post-Old Testament times. Now let's look at Israel's history and God's activity. The 19th century British journalist William Ewer wrote, "How odd of God to choose the Jews." Well, grace is an amazing and in some ways odd thing. Why did God select the nation of Israel and not another nation? Not because it possessed some right or it earned God's favor to be chosen, that's for sure. Israel was sinful just like the rest of us. Israel owed its very existence to the saving activity of God in history. Israel's status as a theocracy, which meant that they were under God's rule, was a privilege and a responsibility rooted in God's grace. The law of Moses didn't stand on its own as a mere ancient law code. It's unique in that it's interwoven into a dynamic historical narrative of covenant-making God's activity through Israel from its beginnings. God said in Exodus chapter 20, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage or slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." Exodus chapter 20. God's act of gracious deliverance, along with his interaction with human beings in history, sets the context for God's giving the Mosaic law. In fact, the events in Israel's story often illustrate and clarify matters raised in the Mosaic law. So we'll misunderstand these Mosaic matters if we think Israel's obligations consisted only in eating kosher foods, remaining ritually clean by staying away from corpses and carcasses, and going to the health inspector priest to have skin diseases, scabs, and house mold examined. For one thing, God desired that Israel love him and cling to him, which isn't exactly reducible to keeping laws. That's love cannot be forced or shown by keeping laws. Love must be a product of a transformed heart. Also, God's actions in history shaped his people's identity as God's covenant people. The deliverance from Egypt, in turn, was to shape the nation's inner motivation out of gratitude. For example, because God graciously rescued his people from because God graciously rescued his people from Egypt, Israel was to remember to treat with compassion the strangers and less fortunate in their midst, because Israel was a stranger and less fortunate in the midst of Egypt. His people were not to forget that they themselves were once slaves in a foreign land. And God reminded them of that repeatedly in those verses. We've all met parents who think their kids can do no wrong. It's frustrating when you're the one trying to coach kids in sports or teach them in a classroom. Some critics trump up this same charge against God that he's treating Israel with a blind favoritism. I find it hard to believe that Israel would think, as they were, for instance, in bondage in Egypt, that they would think that they were being treated with blind favoritism. I find it hard to believe that Israel would think, as they came out of Egypt and were tempted with thirst and with hunger, that they thought that God was treating them favorably. Blindly, favorably. Of course, he had reasons for why he did those things, as the text bears out. It's very obvious that God was not treating Israel with blind favoritism, In fact, God promised Israel that she would and did receive the same judgments God brought on morally corrupt nations surrounding her. God regularly reminded Israel that it wasn't her righteousness, but rather God's grace that brought about her chosen status. In response, Israel was to treat the poor and vulnerable with compassion and to be a blessing to the surrounding nations. This picture expresses what one scholar calls the grace gratitude ideal, which says this is what God has done for you, therefore, out of gratitude, you should do the same for others. The very context of the law was grace. Having no other gods, along with the other 9 commandments, is preceded by the reminder that God has delivered his people out of bondage. Being God's graciously chosen people meant Israel's obligation to live wisely before the nations. Some atheist philosophers have objected to the idea of a chosen people, that this by itself is inherently immoral. Louise Antony asks, what part of chosen people do you not understand? Actually, she hasn't understood it all that well. Not only does God threaten Israel with the same judgments he brings on other nations, but he also reminds Israel that he's at work in the nations around the world, in the nations of the world. God says, are you not as the sons of Ethiopia to me, sons of Israel? Have I not brought up Israel from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Ker? That's from the prophet Amos, chapter 9. When we encounter Melchizedek, Abimelech, Job, Rahab, Ruth, and other non-Israelites in the Old Testament, we're reminded of Paul's words, that a rescuing and redeeming God isn't far from each one of us, whether before or after Christ. And God's choosing Israel was not an end in itself, but a means of blessing all the nations. One nation under God. The manifest destiny idea has shaped much of American life, though the term came into use in the 1840s to validate the United States' expansion into Texas, Mexico, and Oregon. Early in America's history, many Protestants who came to America believed they were extending the Reformation. God's special hand of blessing was upon them as they hoped to realize the post-millennial dream, bringing God's kingdom to earth. That's the post-millennial dream, God's kingdom coming to earth. Governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, saw the New England colony as a city upon a hill with the eyes of all people upon us. The problem here was that the early colonists' vision was blurred. They didn't distinguish between church and state. They assumed that they were the new people of God embarking on a new exodus, an errand in the wilderness, to do theocracy the right way. Today, many American Christians seem to mix up church and state. They believe the community of genuine believers in America is the people of God, both in heaven and on earth. If the nation of America isn't the people of God, we don't live in a theocracy. The sooner Christians realize this, the sooner the church can make a deeper impact as salt and light in society. Things were different at Mount Sinai. True theocracy was being created, the only one that would ever exist. Church and state were united. Some readers may be thinking, but Muslims have their theocracies too. Copan does not take the time here to argue for Old Testament's unique authority as God's special revelation to Israel, as opposed to, say, the Quran. Copan's just trying to help make better sense of the difficulties found within the Old Testament. Under the Mosaic covenant, national Israel uniquely existed as a theocracy, and even this arrangement wasn't intended to be ideal and permanent. This environment would help prepare the cultural and theological context for God's revelation of Jesus of Nazareth when the fullness of time came. The ministry of the death and resurrection of Jesus and the gift of the Spirit would lead to the creation of a new inter-ethnic community, the true Israel, as the new royal priesthood and holy nation, the church. The Old Testament theocracy gave way to a new covenant community from every nation and language, the church, like I said. Fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 marked the finality of this transition, signaling the demise of the national ethnic Israel as the people of God. Again, Old Testament Israel was the one and only genuine theocracy ever to exist, and it was temporary at that. Furthermore, national Israel was established by God to help set the religious, cultural, and historical context for the saving work of Jesus, the Messiah, later in history. The ultimate goal is nothing less than God's salvation being brought to all the nations, and seeing his righteous rule finally established. Holiness in all of life. The Israelites seem to have laws concerning everything: food laws, clothing laws, planting laws, civil laws, laws regarding marriage and sexual relations. These weren't intended to be exhaustive. Rather, they were to be viewed first as visible reminders to live as God's holy people in every area of life. There wasn't any division between the sacred and the secular, between the holy and the profane. God was concerned about holiness of all things, the major and the minor, the significant and the mundane. In such legislation, Israel was being reminded that she was different, a holy people set apart to serve God. Holiness wasn't just for official priests, it was for the entire people of Israel. In fact, they were called a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Since God is set apart, his people were to be so as well. His people were to be set apart as well. The Israelites were to be marked off just as Sabbath day was marked off or set apart as holy to the Lord. We could rephrase the command to be holy, for I, the Lord, am holy, this way: You shall be my people and mine alone, for I am your God and yours alone. This relationship can be compared to the serious marriage vows Copan talked about earlier. Being God's people meant living lives dedicated to God in every aspect of life. This holiness wasn't religious pretense, a phoniness that looked intact and decent on the outside but was cracked and rotting within. When God prescribed rituals, he wanted them to represent humility of heart and love for God and neighbor. God hated rites like festivals, solemn assemblies, burnt offerings, and grain offerings when God's people ignored justice and righteousness. Jesus came and said something like that as well in the New Testament. When he said things like, you people honor me with your lips, but your heart is far from me. That's exactly what the Pharisees did. They went through all the rituals, but ignored the weightier matters of the law. Yeah, so eating kosher foods and paying careful attention to rituals didn't matter if the worship of God and treatment of others weren't kosher. Food, clothing, and planting laws weren't nitpicky commands as God gave to oppress Israel. The prophets reminded Israel that God was primarily concerned about justice, mercy, and walking humbly before God. This underlying moral concern, however, didn't cancel out ritual prescriptions, with their rich theological meaning, even much later in Israel's history after the Babylonian exile. The Christian, and we should throw in the non-Christian too, should learn the lesson God wanted to teach ancient Israel. Living under God's reign should affect all of life, and that's true today. God's presence permeates and saturates our world. Heaven and earth are full of God's glory. God isn't God isn't cordoned off to some private religious realm. God is, either by direct control or divine permission, so as to not violate human freedom, sovereignly at work in all the rhythms of creation and workings of human history. He's weaving together a tapestry to bring all things to their climax in Christ. As the hymn writer put it, God speaks to me everywhere. We're going to look at clean and unclean. We've heard the line, cleanliness is next to godliness. In the Old Testament, this was closer to the truth than what we may think today. What does all this language of cleanness and uncleanness, or purity and impurity, mean? Why the ablutions for the pollutions? Why the need for purification? While we Westerners may think all of this strange, many other cultures, tribal, Islamic, Hindu, can more readily relate to such a picture. We'll be helped by thinking in terms of analogies and symbolism, not in terms of arguments, in our effort to better understand purity laws and the notions of clean and unclean. Cleanness and uncleanness are symbols or pictures, and the Hebrew idea of life and death is behind these pictures. For the Hebrew, life wasn't mere biological existence. Humans could be biologically alive, yet living in the realm of death, spiritual, moral, psychological, emotional, ruin, and alienation. They could be alive biologically, but spiritually dead, morally dead, psychologically dead, emotionally dead. Alienated from God. Uncleanness symbolizes the loss of life. So when you read all those Old Testament texts about being unclean, you can read into that. You can make the mental picture of separated from God, dead, spiritually dead. Although many English translations use terms such as uncleanness and impurity, we shouldn't think these referred to health and hygiene. This isn't the case. Perhaps the term taboo, which suggests something non-moral and perhaps mysterious that is off limits regarding time, food, death, or sex, might capture the idea more effectively. The priest needed to be physically whole, without defect, so that the sanctuary of God might not become common. This doesn't mean that a physical defect is sinful or wrong. Being polluted isn't identical to being immoral, although immorality brings pollution or is taboo. After all, animals that are taboo or unclean are still part of God's good creation. And when unclean, Israelites were not prohibited from worshiping God or even celebrating feasts. They were only prohibited from entering the sanctuary. Furthermore, sex is a good gift from God and is not sinful within the bounds of marriage, yet a heterosexual marriage. Yet purification was necessary after sex, so as to show the distinction between God and human beings. Keep in mind that the various ancient Near Eastern gods engage in all kinds of sexual activity, unlike the biblical God. Life, on the other hand, means being rightly connected to God and to the community and properly functioning, whole, or well-ordered within peace, or well-ordered within. Peace is shalom. As we'll see, carnivorous animals, whether predators or scavengers, are connected with death and therefore are unclean. Ritual uncleanness in Israel was inevitable and frequent, but not in itself sinful. Yet the ultimate concern behind cleanness, uncleanness, and holiness is the human heart, the very point that Jesus made in Mark chapter 7. When he said, not what goes into a man makes him unclean, but what comes out of a man makes him unclean. Even though sin goes beyond ceremonial matters, it still defiles or pollutes us. Sin creates moral impurity or uncleanness before God. In the Old Testament, ethical concerns, sin, can't be separated from matters of purity. Murder, for example, symbolically defiles or pollutes the land, so it must be cleansed. The same can be said about the language of abomination. It has to be the same kind of overlap as uncleanness. Sometimes it refers to, and other times, ceremonial impurity, and these categories aren't always neatly distinguished in the Old Testament. To sum up, the law refers to two kinds of impurity. First is ritual impurity, which is the result of contact with natural processes of birth, death, and sexual relations. The second kind of impurity is moral impurity, through three serious sins in particular. Moral impurity is brought on by idolatry, the worship of a false god, incest, sexual relations with a close family member, and murder. Again, cleanness was ultimately a heart issue. The nearer one came to God, the cleaner one had to be. Approaching God was a serious business, and doing so called for self-scrutiny and preparation. This reminds me of the New Testament admonitions when taking the Lord's Supper. It's a call to examine oneself, to confess sin prior to coming to the Lord's table. This speaks of self-scrutiny and preparation, preparing the heart to receive the Lord's Supper, to come to the Lord's table. We have to scrutinize ourselves and prepare ourselves to do that, because it says, if anyone takes of the supper in an unworthy manner, they heap judgment upon themselves. Pursuit of cleanness was kind of a spiritual dressing down, an inner unveiling or internal examination of where one stood in relation to God. Now, cleanness and uncleanness are opposite each other, and Israelites could move in and out of these temporary states. In the course of life, they would become vulnerable to uncleanness. For example, an Israelite could touch a carcass or have a child and become unclean, but then purify herself or offer a sacrifice and become clean again. Cleanness and uncleanness are symbolic of life and death, respectively. Cleanness symbolizes life, uncleanness symbolizes death. Humans move between these two relative temporary states because of childbirth, male and female issues, contact with death, and sinful acts. These states represent being with or without life. Stable status of holiness, on the other hand, reflects closeness to life found in God, and an Israelite had to be clean and closer to life in order to approach the tabernacle's outer court. The high priest had to be clean and was specially set apart or holy to enter the Holy of Holies just once a year. Holy articles, such as the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy of Holies, remained holy and did not become unclean, even if the sanctuary might be cleansed under unusual circumstances. More clearly in the New Testament, Jesus, the Holy and Righteous One, touched lepers and the hemorrhaging woman, but remained unpolluted. The relationship between life and death, holiness and cleanness, uncleanness, is illustrated in the figure below. Excuse me. Holiness came in degrees of set apartness. For example, the people, the Levites, the high priest. People were set apart to a lower degree. The Levites were set apart to a higher degree than the people. The high priest was set apart to a higher degree from the rest of the Levites and the people. The closer an Israelite drew to a holy God, moving from the tabernacle's or the temple's outer court to the holy place, the Holy of Holies, the more requirements he had to follow and precautions he had to take. Their consecration, high priests had special garments, washings, anointings with oil, and ceremonies that marked them as set apart. The Nazarites, as explained in chapter 6 of the book of Numbers, took sacred vows and consecration to God. This was shown by avoiding alcohol, haircuts, and contact with dead things. If someone from a priestly line couldn't give evidence of his ancestry, he was considered unclean, unfit for closely approaching God. There was a hierarchy of holiness in Israel. Now we're going to talk about not getting mixed up with others. Attentive parents will regularly tell their kids to avoid getting mixed up with the wrong crowd. Bad company corrupts good character. That is quoted by Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33, and the principle is laid out in the beginning of the book of Psalms, where it says, the blessed man doesn't walk in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stand in the way of sinners, nor sit in the seat of the scornful, but delights in the law of the Lord and meditates on the law day and night. Likewise, God gave the Israelites certain actions to carry out as a way of symbolically telling the Israelites not to get mixed up with the false ways of the nations. Israel wore certain badges of holy distinction that separated them from morally and theologically corrupted nations surrounding them. Israel was not to get mixed in with those nations' mindsets and behaviors. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 19, and Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 9 to 11 prohibit mixed breeding and other attempts at mixing or crossbreeding of cattle. They could not plant different types of crops with two different kinds of seed in the same field. Though this may refer to a Canaanite magical practice of the wetting of different seeds to conjure up fertile crops, no clothing mixed with fibers such as wool and linen, there were no polyesters, and no plowing with both ox and donkey. The law also refers to improper sexual mixing, as with adultery, incest, bestiality, and homosexuality, since these were viewed as crossing boundaries. Likewise, because God created male and female, wearing the clothes of a person of the opposite sex, by which divinely ordained sexual distinctions could be blurred or spheres crossed, was prohibited. Men were to distinctively be men, and women were to distinctively be women. As we'll see, the same applied to clean and unclean animals. These anti-mixing commands attempted to portray a sense of wholeness, completeness, and integrity. This is why the priests and animal sacrifices weren't allowed to have any physical deformity. A number of scholars reasonably claim that God was reminding Israel of her own distinctive holy calling, even in the very foods Israel was to eat. Animals that crossed, or in a sense transgressed, the individual and distinctive spheres of air, water, or land were considered unclean. Gordon Wenham puts it this way, quote, in creation, God separated between light and darkness, waters and waters. The ban on all mixtures, especially mixed breeding, shows man following in God's steps. He must separate what God created separate, unquote. Food laws, interwoven with many other Mosaic commands regarding purity, symbolized the boundaries God's people were to keep before them. The sanctuary was one. The sanctuary was God's visible presence, was where God's visible presence was manifested. The sanctuary was God's habitation. God gave laws to remind his people to remind his people of their own set apartness from all creation and how God was to be approached. For example, priests as well as sacrificed animals had to be without defect or blemish. Also, the land of Israel. The land of Israel was set in the midst of pagan nations with false gods, and thus there were certain commands that marked off the Israelites from other nations. So Israel's land, Israel's sacrifices, and Israel's food all had social and theological significance. Israel's various boundaries were to remind her of her relationship to God and to the nations around her. Just as God was set apart from human beings, Israel was to be set apart in its behavior and theology from the surrounding nations. Just as the tabernacle represented sacred space within Israel, so the land of Israel itself represented a set apartness in contrast to the nations around it. Copan has tried to set the stage for discussing food and other purity laws in more detail. Copan will do so in the next chapter. That is the end of chapter number 7. Next time, we will look at part 2 of this issue of the Bible's Ubiquitous, Weirdness, Kosher foods and Kooky laws in chapter 8 of Is God a Moral Monster? Thank you for tuning in today to this episode of Blessed Man Meditations, where we looked at chapter 7 of Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan, in which we made sense of the Old Testament God. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Please consider supporting this ministry by purchasing my published work, the 30th chapter volume on the volume on the first 30 chapters of the Book of Psalms, entitled Pinnacles and Plateaus: Meditations with the Psalmist. And I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.